Welcome to the Fat Emperor podcast. I'm your host, Ivor Cummins. Hey guys, before we go ahead with the podcast and the good stuff, just want to make a note to let you know that I'm on odyssey.com. There's my channel, and it's odyssee.com, and you can sign up there in no time and subscribe to my channel there. And one of the reasons is that I've been censored recently, extraordinarily. I even had a video from Professor Emeritus of Immunology, Beda M. Stadler, the Fauci of Switzerland. He's a pharma industry guy, but his interview with me was taken down and the appeal was rejected. So because there's extraordinary censorship going on, it's quite unbelievable to me over the past months, you can sign up and subscribe to me here, and everything will always be there, all the professors, all the data, all the science. So please do that and keep yourself informed. The links are in the description box below as well if you want to just click there. But in any case, please do subscribe. I'll also have everything on the other platforms as well, of course. So with that, we'll get ahead with the pod. Thank you. A real treat today, guys, because I'm going to be having a podcast with Jonny Bowden, PhD. And for those of you who don't know, which won't be many, he's the guy who for decades now has been trying to turn over the absurd cholesterol hypothesis and all of this pharma and food industry obsession with cholesterol that's kind of prevented low carb and healthy keto getting traction. So there's a big price that's been paid for this nonsense. But anyway, Jonny, you're the man who ripped the heart out of the nonsense. How many years ago did you start?
Well, actually, first of all, thank you very much for that. But I really stand on the shoulders of giants. What I think Dr. Sinatra and I did in our book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, was simply bring a lot of information that had been there for a long time to the public. If I have any talent, it's simply communication to the general public. But look at Ufe, look at Malcolm Kendrick in England, all writing books like The Great Cholesterol Con, Anthony Coppola. These were really massive treatises looking at all of the science. And, that's kind of where it started. I just was lucky enough to discover that stuff and then to do our own deep dive into the research and confirm what they had been talking about for a long time. But the problem was they were only talking to other academics. Academics aren't always the best communicators to the general public. And that's what I think we did. We didn't create this skepticism. We simply made it more available to a larger group. And that's what we're trying to do in the new book, because we did that book in 2010 and it was published in 2012, went on Dr. Oz, it got a lot of attention. But at the time that we wrote that, what we knew was that we were looking at the wrong target by looking at cholesterol, especially because, and I hope we'll get into this, because we're measuring the damn thing completely wrong to begin with. So there's two big fallacies in the whole cholesterol argument. One, we're not even measuring something that matters. And two, we're hanging our hats on this measurement. It's kind of like hanging your health diagnosis on the metric of whether somebody's short or tall. It's an antiquated measure. So we knew that was true back then. And it was kind of radical information for the general public. But 10 years later, so much research has confirmed that in one way or the other, starting right around when we published with that huge study, Siri Torino in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They did that like 347,000 patients looking at saturated fat and endpoints. And I hope we'll get into the difference between looking at cholesterol and looking at what we really care about, which is whether you get a heart attack. They are not the same thing, but they looked at what we really care about. Do people who eat more saturated fat have more cardiovascular disease? And the answer was a resounding no. And that was just as the first edition came out. Since then, 2014, Annals of Internal Medicine, British Medical Journal, Zoe Harcum, this stuff has just been pouring in, showing that this relationship between saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease that everybody thinks is kind of a linear relationship is just, it was a hypothesis that turned out to not be true, and we're hanging on to it like a flip phone. And that's really, I think, what the message of the book is. I mean, there's several of them. One is, to understand the difference, and I hope we'll talk about this because I actually got so much of this from your work, the difference between cholesterol and lipoproteins. Most people in my country have no idea of the difference. And if you don't understand the difference between the lipoprotein and cholesterol, you're kind of screwed in understanding why the whole thing is a myth. So that's a message I really want to get in. The second, of course, is what I just alluded to, which is the test is obsolete. The test is literally well, the flip phone example is great. You know, when I was growing up, they used to have health fairs, and you'd go into the health fair, and there'd be someone there, and in this particular section, and they do a little pinprick, and they say, "Oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is 210, you're just fine," or "It's 190," or whatever it is. And then around 1960s, they started noticing that cholesterol actually travels in the blood in packages. And there were sort of two vaguely different packages, one they called HDL and one they called LDL, and they decided to call one of them good and one of them bad, even though it's the same cholesterol. And that L in HDL and LDL stands for lipoprotein. So the lipoprotein is the boat, as I think you've said a million times, it's a great analogy. The lipoprotein is the boat, the cholesterol is the cargo. And one of the biggest myths, the biggest cholesterol myths, is that we keep looking at the cargo like it matters. We need to be looking at the boats. Why? Because just common sense. When you got millions of boats in the water, there's more likely to be an accident. When you have millions of people in a nightclub, more likely somebody's going to bump into one another and there's going to be a fight. Anytime you have a big crowd, you need to know that, because there are problems that arise that don't arise with smaller crowds. So what should we be looking at? How many boats are in the water? Not what they're carrying. And we have just somehow mythologized this incredibly important molecule, cholesterol, which is needed for the brain and the immune system and memory and thinking and you name it. We've demonized this cargo as if that's causing the problems. Yeah, when the boats crash, they spill their cargo. It's not just cholesterol, it's triglycerides and protein, and then calcium comes into the mix. So there's a lot of stuff, but it ain't cholesterol that's causing it. And that's one of the biggest myths, because, and I'll shut up after this, because when you think about it, the entire dietary guidelines have been premised on the idea of avoiding cholesterol both in the food and in the blood. Why? Because we think it causes heart disease. Why do we avoid animal products? Why? They raise cholesterol. Why do we care? Because we think it causes heart disease, and so on and so forth. When you expose this as a myth and you start really delving into it, as you have done, and as I think we did in our book, you realize that the dietary guidelines would collapse like a house of cards. This whole low-fat, crazy, high-carb, high-processed food diet started and became the official recommendations of almost every country because of this fear of the cargo on the boat.
Absolutely, Johnny. And that was a great rant to cover the core of it. It's insane. And I discovered it way back years after you had come out with the book. And I kind of discovered it independently because I had high cholesterol and high GGT, and the doctors couldn't answer any bloody questions. So I went and researched it, and then I realized some of this madness back then. But yeah, even the lipoproteins, I mean, it's a great analogy to talk about like high numbers and crashing into each other. But then you can even bring it further where some people have super highways. That's the way they're built, and they have high numbers and they still don't have a problem. So, but looking at the LDL, and I think, I don't know, was it you or was it Sinatra or someone was saying that, like, oh, it could have been that Professor Sikora in the, Professor Blood in Australia, who he popped up a few years ago, Ken Sakara. Anyway, he came up with the thing that total cholesterol is 30 or 40-year-old out-of-date technology, and some doctors are still using it. Yeah. Yeah. And LDL then, the bad cholesterol, that's kind of 20 years out of date. And basically, if you're talking about lipoprotein numbers, and particularly small dense LDL and the shapes and the nature of the lipoproteins and the health of the lipoproteins, then you're finally up to date. But most doctors are still stuck either 30, 40-year-old technology or at best 20-year-old with the good and bad.
Let me just say, and this is something we certainly didn't discover, we are simply pointing it out and showing the research that proves it. There are now 13 different subtypes of cholesterol. There is, as you mentioned, the small kinds, which are very atherogenic. The LDLA, they sometimes categorize them as in small atherogenic. I'm sorry, the LDLB, which are like little BB gun pellets, and they're atherogenic and oxidized and inflamed. And then there are the big fluffy ones that are like, big old cotton balls, and they don't really do much damage. There's 13 different subtypes. They behave differently in the body. There are metrics now, and they are widely available. These are not some esoteric tests you beg your doctor to do. For God's sake, LabCorp does them and Quest does them, where they actually measure the number of particles being LDL, HDL. They're just all of the cholesterol carrying mechanisms. They measure that. They measure the shape of them. They measure the pattern in which they arrive. Some of these are very inflammatory. Even some of the HDL particles are a little inflammatory. 2A, 2B. There are lots of different HDL ones. They're not all great, Those boats get in trouble too. And not all LDLs, for God's sake, are bad. There's 13 categories here, folks. So literally, this is to me like doing a medical diagnosis based on if you're short or tall. Now, that's a metric. It's something you might want to know. There are certain diseases that happen, I guess, more frequently with people who are very, very tall, and certain diseases that happen more frequently with people who are very, very short. But in the era when we have 30,000 genes and we have decoded the human genome, are you really going to do a diagnosis on short or tall? And that's what we're doing with HDL, LDL, which people, for reasons that are so completely out of date, thought were good and bad cholesterol. It's ridiculous. It's like saying good and bad towels in the Bed Bath and Beyond. I mean, they're towels, and what you use them for and how they behave has much more to do with other factors than the actual towelness of it. Cholesterol as itself, as a molecule, is essential for life. It's essential for your brain, and it's essential for immunity. And why we are hanging our hats on this one demonized molecule, it's just a throwback to 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And I had to pinch myself for many years. I still had to pinch myself at the way that they're still persisting with this myth. And there was a French film, actually, a documentary about statins a few years ago, and it was very good. And I saved a copy. It was subtitled. But there were a couple of Americans on it, and Nina Teicholz, I think, was in it. But it was a French documentary, and it was very hard-hitting on a lot of what we're talking about. And they had one cardiologist, and he admitted, he said, when the statins came out and they did these trials and it looked like they were great, we all bought it. But over the years, I realized how absurd it was. He said the very idea that evolution would create a good cholesterol that's good for us and also create a bad one to cause heart disease, that the system would create that. He said it's so absurd that a good and a bad one. Do we have a bad red blood cell and a good white blood cell? It's just so absurd, really, yeah?
It is. And I'll tell you one of the reasons that I was so excited to do this podcast and to actually meet you. I know that we did say hello once a couple of years ago, but is that when we did this book, your YouTube lectures and discussions were so incisive and well documented and well explained. And this book of yours, huge fan. We quote both you and Dr. Gerber in the book. And one of the things that I resonated with you about was that you were an outsider looking at this. Now, I don't know if you know my background, but I was very much an outsider. I started life as a professional musician. That's what I was doing when I first learned that it was possible to get fit. And I was well into my late 30s, early 40s when I really made that career change and life change. And what happened for me is I started as a personal trainer. And I bought into, this was during the low-fat mania. And I have to say probably 99% of other trainers really bought into it. And we would see our clients doing everything we told them to, tons of Stairmasters, and they're eating low fat and they're stuff, and they're not losing weight. Now, I'm not going to be hyperbolic and say nobody ever lost weight on a low fat diet. Obviously, there are outliers. As a general health plan, it has been a massive failure, and it wasn't working on a lot of our clients. I'd say the majority. And this was around early 90s. remember, my only training here is as a trainer, and trainers get like this much nutrition, and it's all the American Dietetic Association, which is the handmaiden of the American Medical Association. They used to believe supplements weren't necessary because you can get everything you need in food, and it's just terrible. And that's what we learned, and that's what we believed, and that's what we taught our clients. So when they weren't losing weight on this cockamamie, exercise more and eat less kind of philosophy, we assumed, mea culpa on this, we assumed it was that they were lying, that they were cheating. They couldn't be doing what we were telling, because it would work. We were so unhumble, we would never even occur to us that our advice was ridiculous and it was wrong. We didn't even want to examine it. There's a wonderful TED lecture by Peter Attia, who I know you know, which is basically his apology to the world as a doctor for believing this stuff about diabetics and thinking they were bringing it on themselves and that they just weren't exercising. And he was you could almost see his eyes tear up in that lecture. It's a terrific lecture. Look it up, folks, Peter Attia on TED. So we all believed that it just, they weren't doing it because we wouldn't question our conventional wisdom. Now, here's the outsider part of it that I relate to. So here I am, and I have clients who come in. It's around 1991 or so, and the Atkins diet was just republished. It was the third edition of Atkins' New Diet Revolution. And we, like everybody else in conventional medicine and nutrition, thought this guy was a quack. He should be he should have his medical license removed. He was recommending bacon and pork rinds. What was he talking about? This was terrible. And our clients, who were frustrated by the low-fat diet and the lack of results, would come in quite understandably, and they'd say, I got a neighbor or a golfing buddy or a hairdresser who did this Atkins thing. Look, I'm going to try it. And we would be mortified. We'd go, man, you cannot, look, you might lose a pound or two. Sure, models lose weight on eating asparagus and cocaine, so you could lose the weight, but that's not the metric. You can eat all that cholesterol and saturated fat, you're going to die of a heart attack. But they didn't listen. And I remember distinctly, one client in particular who just had not been able to move the needle on anything. And he comes in, and he's starting to lose weight. His belly's starting to shrink. His eyes are a little clearer. He tells me his blood pressure, which he checks all the time, has gone down. And he certainly didn't die. That's for sure. And this presents what psychologists call cognitive dissonance. Yeah. You have two ideas that can't both be true. They're contradictory, and you're trying to hold both of them, and it creates an uncomfortable mental state where you just have to resolve it. They both can't be true. So either the Atkins diet kills you, or this guy standing in front of me is an illusion. One or the other, because they can't both be so. And then kind of with the only training I had in health and fitness being, personal training certifications, and I had 6 of them, but that ain't exactly an education in nutrition and functional medicine. So I would look at this and go, something's not right here. Is it possible? Obviously the guy's real and these people are getting results. Could there be something wrong with what we had been taught? And that's when I realized that what we had been taught was hanging on the concept of you got to eat to reduce your cholesterol, which means no animal products, which means no fats, because we all know that this is a road to hell. To metabolic health, but it wasn't. And here's what happened for me that I don't know if this happened for you, but I had been teaching trainers at this point in my life. I was pretty good at that. And I would, of course, according to the low fat, but I taught biomechanics and anatomy and all the stuff that trainers do in nutrition. And nobody ever said, what's he doing teaching nutrition? He's a personal trainer. I had a master's in psychology, but that certainly didn't qualify me to teach nutrition. So where's his credential? Nobody said that. Now I start going up in front of training bodies and personal trainers and saying, I think we need to rethink this saturated fat thing. And here's some evidence. Here's a study on serum biomarkers in ketogenic diets in men. I remember that one particularly because it was one of the first ones that said, wait, this is not the way they're telling us it's supposed to be. These people are improving on these diets. And I'd start teaching that way, and en masse, they came at me who is this guy? He doesn't have any credentials. He's not even a nutritionist. And I got that outsiders thing, which I'm sure you get to some degree too. And that's what prompted me to go back and get a PhD in nutrition, at which point, with the letters and the board certification, I could say, guys, I'm still thinking that you're full of it. And except I had a little bit of backing and they couldn't say anymore, or they still do. They attack where I went to school and they attack, they do. But I don't care. I mean, the information stands up.
Exactly, yeah. And the thing is, it's great to have the PhD. You've got some defense, but to be honest, the paradigm is so entrenched and the falsehood now and the cognitive dissonance that they'll still attack you. And they'll say, well, yeah, he's got a PhD, but he's a quack. He's a cholesterol denier.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Many of us, me, Sinatra, but way more credentialed people than me. John Abramson of Harvard, were in a movie that was put on by the Australian Broadcasting Company. It was a two-parter called The Heart of the Matter, and in it, we did a lot of questioning. All of us.
Was that Marianne Damasi? That special?
What it was? Yes, it was.
It got banned.
She came to this house and interviewed me in my garden. Yes, that was her.
She got in trouble over that.
Trouble. Let me tell you,
the pharma industry went crazy with that one.
There was a letter. They showed me a letter written by a group of doctors in I guess it was either Australia or England. It was a letter written to the newspaper, and it said, 31,000 people will die if people listen to Bowden and Sinatra's advice. They took the damn thing off YouTube, man.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a concerted effort, and this wasn't just some cockamamie nutritionist who gets all hyperbolic and these were professors at Harvard. These were serious people raising these questions, and the amount of attack. When we went on Dr. Oz, 6 doctors from Columbia wrote a letter protesting that he had given us airtime. So yes, I don't think this is changing in the world in our lifetimes, but the reason I do, and I suspect you do, these podcasts and these lectures, is there are people who we are reaching. And it is a small change. But you know what? Malcolm X used to say, I talk to an audience of 1,000 people, but if I connect with one person and change their life, that's a success. And I think that's I don't have high hopes that we're going to change the medical profession. We quote in our book an American writer named Upton Sinclair, who said, it is very difficult to get a man to change his position when his salary depends on not changing his position.
I love that one, and their whole life. And you know what I reckon, Johnny? I often thought about this. So there is the salary depends on it, and that's huge. But also there's the cognitive dissonance of facing that you may have been misdirecting people into poorer health for 30 years as a professional expert. Not many people can face that internally, psychologically. They just say that no way that's going to happen.
And that's why I like Peter Attia lecture, because that's exactly what he does. This was a successful guy in practice, 20 years treating diabetics and heart disease. And he literally said, I apologize.
Yeah. Not many will do that, though. Very, very few. And Professor Noakes is one who stood up and ripped his own pages.
Professor Noakes is the ultimate example of this. And look what happened. And look how they did him, right?
Yeah, but look at the resilience too. I mean, the lucky thing in this world is the people who are willing to have leadership, they're also tough people and they're principled and they can take blows. But I must say, Tim took very heavy blows. He even told me afterwards, like his wife is very hard on them both. The abuse he got, he was disowned by his alma mater. His old professor, who I don't know, he used to work with, disowned him and said he was killing people, telling people to eat less carb and more fat. I mean, and then he had the court case. I mean, he really got put through the ringer, but he came out stronger.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you a fast story, which you might know, but maybe some other people don't. It's the story of Dr. Kilmer McCulley. Do you know him? Great. Then you'll love it.
I know that name, but
discovered homocysteine. He discovered homocysteine. So
the homocysteine thing.
Yeah, the homocysteine thing. So here's this respected Harvard doctor with his own lab who has just impeccable credentials and reputation. And he comes upon this inflammatory compound in the blood called homocysteine. And he was, like many scientists, just kind of wondering about things. And he had a lot of child patients who had early signs of heart disease, and it didn't make sense. Their cholesterol wasn't that elevated or elevated at all, and they just didn't fit the profile. And he kept trying to look for some kind of connection, and he realized that all of them had very high levels of this inflammatory compound that we all now know called homocysteine. Not only, when he started to present this at conferences, not only are there were actual videos of this, of people laughing at him. He was demoted at Harvard. They moved his lab over a period of a year of this. It was like, come on, you got to stop talking about this. We all know it's cholesterol. And he didn't stop talking about it. They moved his lab to the basement. They took his grad students away. So he had like one lab assistant. And he ultimately had to leave in quote unquote disgrace.
Yeah.
25 years later, they rehire him back. And homocysteine is now on the map, and it's now on all the lab tests. It's a basic measure, and we do know that it's related to things that have very much a relationship to heart disease. So there is a big connection. I wouldn't say it causes it, but I'd say it's something to keep an eye out. And that information, because it was different than what these doctors had been taught, literally made him an object of ridicule and an object of derision when they literally took him off the faculty of Harvard. And he was completely, as you point out with Dr. Noakes, vindicated and it's celebrated. It takes a long time to change people's minds.
It does. And there's multiple big machines that will chew you up and spit you out if you threaten the machine. And one of them is the whole academic pride thing. That's what happened to him. And sometimes it's more industry directly gets involved, like your show in Australia, the two-parter. The pharma got in there and they got in there big time. Who is the other one? Mary Enig, who came out against vegetable oils, quite rightly. She was abused, right?
I knew Mary Enig. Mary Enig was someone I had taken some workshops with. I interviewed her multiple times. This is the woman, ladies and gentlemen, that basically discovered that trans fats kill us. I mean, and this was in an atmosphere in which it just wasn't talked about, wasn't done. They didn't even know what trans fats were. She was the least aggressive. She was just like a little grandmother. She had like no animus. There was nothing angry about her. They just took her apart. She was one of the top lipid biochemists in the country. And, the only people who really listened to her were people like you and me. But she made an enormous impression. And now trans fats are banned in America. And I'm telling you, that started with her. And all they did was make fun of her when she talked about that.
Awful. And I believe they shrunk her lab, her influence, they attacked her. And she knew it was industry was behind it. The massive vegetable oil processed food industry was furious. And I remember I went through a phase of looking up carcinogenesis. And in the book as well, we had a chapter on cancer, which is risky. Like talking about cancer is a bit dodgy, but myself and Dr. Gerber were careful.
Here, it's like you get hung for that.
Oh, it's like kind of anti-vax light, but I drew attention to a whole series of papers in the 90s, and all these separate teams were looking at omega-6 vegetable oils, and I don't think they were thinking trans fats at the time. It was even just excessive omega-6, because we got around 1% of calories evolutionary, and now we're going up to 7 or 8%, and now I think it's around 15 in America. And there's amazing studies with pregnant rats, and they were showing that not only is more omega-6 promoting of tumors when they inject them with all this stuff, which was interesting, but one team actually noted that if you get up to around 4% of calories in diet, from 1% omega-6 up to 4, you get an increased line of mammary tumor carcinogenesis, size and quantity, all that stuff. But they noticed that after 4 or 5%, if you go on up to 10 or 12% calories, it doesn't make it worse. And they said, you know what, it looks like there's a threshold effect, that if you push up towards 4% of calories, you drive more cancer, but then after that, it doesn't matter. And you know what they realized? They realized because nearly everyone in America now is at 7 or 8%, you're not even going to see a correlation between omega-6 and cancer, because they're all between like 5 and 12%. So you're not going to see a correlation. And they said to see a correlation, you'd have to actually get humans to go back to 1%. And then we think you'd see a big correlation with cancer. But all those papers, they were all just quietly pushed aside because the vegetable oils were going to save your heart by lowering your cholesterol. There's no way we're going to let guys say they might give you more cancer. It's just not going to happen.
I've got to tell you a story that we talk about in the book. And let me first do a disclaimer. We didn't discover this. Nina talked about it. Gary talked about it. Malcolm Gladwell, the podcaster, did an episode on this story as a human interest story. I think we maybe popularized it and put it in terms that make it more like a story, but we didn't discover it. But it is so critical to our discussion, and you'll love it. You probably have heard it, but during the time when the low-fat diet was being put on the map and the cholesterol madness and fear of saturated fat was the greatest, it was generally thought to kind of, the ground zero for that was the Ansel Keys 7-country study, which we've all exploded a million different times. But during that period, Ansel Keys also did some other studies, and he ran some other studies, and one of them was called the Minnesota Heart Study. Now, the Minnesota Heart Study was another study that was meant to prove, these guys talk about confirmation bias. They already knew the results. I mean, vegetable oil is going to save lives, and, saturated fat is going to claim lives, and we need to have no cholesterol in the diet. And so the Minnesota Heart Study was 7 different centers, and there was a doctor in charge of each center, and then of course they would collaborate and they would get all the data. And there was one particular doctor named Ivan Franz who was in charge of one particular one of these centers. It's such a great story. Let me tell it. I know you know it, but people. And Franz was a scientist. And he realized that he was a believer, a true believer in the cholesterol theory. He was a doctor. He used to test his kids once a week in the morning after breakfast and see what their cholesterol was. I mean, this was a cholesterol Nazi, but he was also a scientist. And he knew that all these other studies were epidemiological, observational, noticing things. They weren't clinical studies. They didn't really do controlled experiments on this stuff. They just observed that, Ansel Keys thought, well, people eat less fat. They have less heart disease. He didn't look much beyond that. And it wasn't even true. So what Franz decides to do is he says, I'm going to do my arm of this study scientifically. I'm going to do a real clinical study. And man, he found institutions where they would have the same population. People lived in these institutions, they were custodial, they were hospitals, whatever they were. He took patients who had longevity there, that he could study the same thing in a controlled environment. You couldn't even do these studies today. He enlisted the cafeteria, he enlisted the doctors, and they controlled what people ate in a real, true, double-blind study. The food looked the same for the low, the people who they substituted all, in group 1, they substituted all the saturated fat for vegetable oil, and they took out all the cholesterol containing foods. But in group 2, which was the control group that ate the crappy diet, they let them eat the saturated fat and everything, but they made it look the same. This guy was so meticulous about making it double-blinded and real that they used to have margarine used to be cut in triangles to distinguish it from butter. So he got a special compensation so that they could cut the margarine and the butter in the same shape, so no one would have a clue as to what anyone was eating. Okay, so the data comes in, and he looks at it, and he is confused because he was very sure that there was going to be a really strong advantage for the people eating vegetable oil. And he was kind of mystified. He thought, I had to calculate wrong. I sampled wrong. Something happened because this can't be so. And he never published it. And he put the data in a big box and, to ponder at some later date to figure out why this study went so badly. 20 years later, there's a researcher at the NIH named Christopher Ramsden. And much like you just said with the, I wonder what happens if you eat more than 4, he said, boy, would I like to do a study, a really good randomized controlled study where we see what happens when people do what we've been telling them to do at unprecedented levels. We've never had vegetable oil, or it's actually linoleic acid is the particular fatty acid that we're talking about, the omega-6 that you mentioned. We've never had omega-6s in the human diet to the degree that we are telling people to consume them now. Corn oil, safflower oil, every one of those oils. Wouldn't it be interesting to do a study to see what really happens in a controlled environment when people eat more omega-6? I'll never get funding for that, he thinks to himself, for all the reasons. Like, who's going to fund that study? What money can be made at it? And then he thinks, wait, shit, that study's been done already. That dude Franz did it. I got to get my hands on the data because that's the study he wanted to do. How do you get your data? He calls the son. The son, Robert Franz, is a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic now, the young son. And he says, can you help me find your dad's data? I want to do this project. He's got the only pristine data on what happens when you eat more vegetable oil than saturated oil. Can you help me? And the son says yes. And they go together to their old family house, which Franz still owns, and they go to the basement, spend a couple of nights after work doing this, and they find the data. And Franz gives it to Ramsden. A month later, Ramsden calls him up, and he says, Dr. Franz, I understand why your father didn't publish his data. It's very compelling, but it's very strange. And he says, what do you mean? He says, well, not only wasn't there an advantage to the people eating the vegetable oil, there was a distinct disadvantage, particularly after a certain age. These people had more risk factors for heart disease and had more bad incidents than the people eating the saturated fat. No wonder he was confused. And then he said, and this is what the heartwarming part of it is, and this is, I think, why Malcolm Gladwell did a podcast on it for a general audience. Then he says, if I were to publish this, I understand it would uproot your father's life work and reflect badly and embarrass you. What do you want me to do? And the younger Franz says, publish it. My father believed in science and he believed in truth more than he believed in being right. So that's the best study that we point out in the book. And now you know it, where we actually tested vegetable oil. I can tell you, I do an interview series like this for you, and like you are, and I did 2 interviews in the last couple of months with really wonderful experts, one of whom is Dr. Kate Shanahan, and the other of whom was Dr. Ifland, who's the leading expert on addictive nutrition. Right. Both of them, fantastic. Both of them said to me, one of them off the air, one of them on the air, that she would like to see one person come forth that has eliminated vegetable oil and sugar from their diet for the last year. She'd like to see one person like that come to her with a bad case of COVID, with like where it's going, not just the kind that you throw off, but the case where they're at hospitals. She said, I'd like to see one. The other one, I don't remember which said which, was that if you took vegetable oil out of the human diet, vegetable and sugar out of the human diet, you'd have an entire different metabolic profile for everybody. This stuff is one of the most inflammatory things in the human diet. And as we talk about in the Great Cholesterol Myth, even in the first edition, one of the greatest promoters of heart disease is not cholesterol, it's inflammation. And what are the most inflammatory things in the human diet? As you point out, omega-6, which is our vegetable oil, which isn't even vegetable oil, it's seed oil. It kills me to think that that's part of the marketing. Is soy a vegetable? It's a seed. All this stuff's seeds. But the vegetable gives it a sense of, oh, it's got to be good. It comes from vegetables. No, it's not. Yeah. It's okay in small amounts. And I think you mentioned the ratio. I don't know if you mentioned the ratio, the percentage, but there's a lot of research on the ideal proportion of omega-6s to omega-3s in the human diet. It's a great metric for health. And I can never pronounce her name, the Greek researcher who does all the omega-3 research. She's done tons of anthropological studies on this. It's like Eritis Somanolis. I'm going to butcher the name, but she's a very, very famous.
Yeah. I always think of, is it Land or Lands, the guy who's done all the omega-3 index and runs a omega quant.
Another one.
He's one of the big ones, yeah. But
a lot of studies on the 3 ratio, and the ideal one, the one that creates the most balance between the inflammatory forces in your body and the anti-inflammatory. We need them both. Inflammation is part of the healing process in the immune system, so we need them both. And they need to be in balance. And what these researchers who've been looking at this for 30 years have found that the ideal ratio in the diet is about 1 to 1. up to 4-1 in favor of 6. You can still get away with like 4-1. You know what we consume here in at least 16-1, and in some parts of the country 25-1, and I'm going to guess all over the world it's somewhere between 16 and 25 times to 1 in favor of the pro-inflammatory omega-6s, and that's because we have told the entire world to consume vegetable oil rather than lard.
Yeah, totally crazy. So again, counterintuitive maybe from what they believed, but they drove it remorselessly. And the other thing is, industry vegetable oils compared to natural fats and real foods are dirt cheap. They cost almost nothing, like the refined grains and sugars, subsidized. And they've got shelf life because these chemicals
Forever.
are basically...
They last forever, right? You can leave them outside in the backyard and come back 10 years later. They're still usable.
And you remember the one in Australia, the guy put out the lump of butter and the lump of margarine, and the ants are all over the butter and there's no ants on the margarine. And he said, we're more stupid than ants. Can we eat that shit? But, you know, I always said, to your point there, you know, the devil's triad, I call it. And so to try and keep it simple for people who don't want to know all the right foods and all. And I say, look, you want to make it simple. The devil's triad is sugar, refined carbs, refined grains, and vegetable oils.
Oh, that's beautifully said. I'm going to wind up stealing that. No, that's a great quote. You are 100% right. I couldn't agree more.
And the second part is that most ultra-processed foods are stuffed with that triad. And that's what makes the ultra-processed foods bad. And it's 60% of United Kingdom calories come from ultra-processed foods now. Go figure. But the thing is, those foods are not really so bad because they have, remember years ago, people were worried about E numbers and colorings. I said, not really that. It's the macro. They're bulked up with the worst crap in the universe that makes up maybe 60, 70% of the calories of the foods. It's not these little things that are added. Yeah, they might be bad for you, but the mass of the food is junk, and it's diabetogenic, it's obesogenic. And all the studies have shown it, but like you say, they're suppressed because now the die is set, the narrative is set, and it means all the professors will all have to be hugely embarrassed for saying the wrong thing for decades. So we need to wait for them all to die off and a new generation to come in.
I hate to say it, but I've said similar things, and I don't mean anybody any harm, but I think it's a generational thing. We really... It's not going to die out in our lifetime. I don't know how much time we have, but I wanted to tell you what we did find in the book, which I think I'm almost sure we got onto this from you, but other people have talked about it. I started early by saying that when we wrote the first edition, we knew cholesterol as we now know and measure it was definitely not what we should be looking for, but we weren't 100% sure what we should be looking for. I'm almost sure it was you who introduced me to Kelly's work, the insulin assay and the tritation. So this guy that you talked about and that we talk about in the book, 1970 was it Kelly, right? Does this?
Oh no, sorry, Dr. Joseph Kraft.
Kraft, not Kelly. Kraft.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm thinking. And Kraft does this. He develops an insulin assay, which is apparently was the state of the art for understanding insulin and how it works in the body. And it was a very cumbersome test, as I remember. You had to stay in the doctor's office like 4 hours, and I don't know where you got the volunteers that would do that, but they did. They had 2 tubes hooked up. One did glucose and one did insulin. They could really see, they could track how responsive your insulin system was to a carbohydrate load. Was it able to clear it? Or were you a little resistant? And he put people in 4 or 5 categories. And the first category was like 20% of them were really insulin sensitive. They give them some sugar, insulin pops right in there. It chirpers it out of the bloodstream. Everything's fine. And it would go downhill from there, to complete insulin resistance. And then he followed those people for 10 years to see what happened to them. In the group that was insulin sensitive, which is an admittedly very small group, there were no heart attacks, there was no heart disease, there was no diabetes. People just weren't dying. And then it got worse and worse as you proceeded down the insulin resistance scale. In the 80s, Gerald Reaven, who invented Syndrome X, which now is called metabolic syndrome or prediabetes, or even more correctly, insulin resistance syndrome, he invents this thing this collection of, he doesn't invent, he discovers that there's a collection of conditions, abdominal obesity, high triglycerides, low HDL, whatever they are, that define a thing called metabolic syndrome, which we now call prediabetes, because that leads directly to diabetes. And at the end of his career, he had all this data showing this, and he thought, I wonder what else insulin resistance tracks with. We never looked outside the box to see if it does anything. And sure enough, insulin resistance tracked with cancer. It tracked with all kinds of other diseases, even outside the cardiometabolic spectrum. So our conclusion from this, in this new book, which I do owe a lot to you for opening my eyes to this research, is that the risk factor that tracks most with heart disease, the one that shows up a decade before your doctor says, oh, Mrs. Jones, your cholesterol is high, or your A1C is going up a little, we got to get you on some 10 years before that happens, this risk factor, insulin resistance, shows up. No one's looking for it. And here's the punchline, as you well know, insulin resistance can be treated, reversed, or prevented. With diet alone, no statins are needed. And if there's one message in this book, it's stop looking at cholesterol and start looking at insulin resistance. And it's easy to do. We tell you how to do it. You know how to do it. But this is the variable that's hiding in plain sight that's connected to all this stuff. And let me just, one last thing, and I'll get off my soapbox. The absolute relevance of this to this moment in time is this. Look at the comorbidities for COVID. Every one of them is a cardiometabolic disease. Every one of them has a connection to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance weakens your entire immune system and makes it much more likely that you will have a very bad reaction if you happen to contract this virus. And that's the relevance of this. This isn't just about changing your diet to lose weight. This isn't just about changing your diet so you don't get, not that that would be a bad goal, so you don't get heart disease. It's also about changing your metabolism and your underlying conditions so that you can resist a lot of things that may be coming down the pike, because all of those conditions weaken your ability to fight off bad stuff.
Absolutely, Johnny. Couldn't say it better myself. And I interviewed Ron Rosedale, who Dr. Ron Rosedale.
The Rosedale diet, that was one of the things I grew up studying. I knew Ron Rosedale. I took classes with him, sure.
He's an incredible guy, and he discovered the importance of insulin and leptin back around 25 years ago, along with Mike Eads, a good buddy of mine. But I'm great pals with Ron. But I actually followed up, and I got hold of him at the start of this Corona thing. It was back in April, one of my first podcasts in Corona. And he was stuck in the lockdown in India. He was helping Indian people. He's very spiritual, very connected to India. But we had a conversation, and by God has it stood the test of time. Basically, his point was exactly what you said, but also leptin resistance goes hand in hand with insulin resistance. And arguably more important, and leptin is a cytokine, which I didn't realize. Leptin is part of the immune cytokine storm, intimately connected in with the immune system. And exactly as you say, and we just talked about, imagine you got two guys, and I'll finish with this one, John and Jack, identical twins, genetically identical, both accountants, both with bellies, pre-diabetic, 50 years old. And John you take, and all you allow him eat for the next 3 or 4 weeks is meat, fish, eggs, and vegetables, above ground vegetables. And Jack just keeps going, eating the American diet. In 3 or 4 weeks, if you spray the same amount of SARS-CoV-2 into each of their faces, the difference in outcome would be enormous. And that was the point. I said within a week or two, you're going to have a completely different severity. And Ron said, within days, Ivor, your insulin and leptin will be right down, your adiponectin will be up. But after a few weeks, let's say, you infect them both badly. John might get away with a day or two off work. Jack might end up in an ICU. You're talking that scale of difference after a few weeks.
Yeah, after a few days. One of my early colleagues, Dr. Barry Sears, who wrote the series, invented the Zone diet, and used to say that you can reverse insulin resistance with a diet in 3 days.
And that's exactly it, that he said literally you can have your leptin by the next day. And within a few days, you're in a different place. And you know, I will have one last thing. I went to Denver in March, and that was just when the Rona blew up, and I was lucky I had to rush and change my flight to get back to Ireland. But I was on stage, I did my talk. But at that conference, I met this guy in his 50s. He was quite overweight. He was Asian extraction, American. And he said, Ivor, and he came up, you saved my life. I want to thank you. What? And his name, I think, was Raj or something. And he said, yeah, I got your book 10 weeks ago. I'm an internist and internal medicine and blah, blah, blah. And he said, I've lost 45 pounds. And I went, whoa. And I thought, and he says, yeah, I used to be very big. And he says, but you know how quickly I reversed or in remission my diabetes, type 2. I was a full-blown type 2 diabetic. And I said, oh, you're going to tell me, I suppose, a few weeks? 10 days, Ivor. He measured his insulin 10 days later and glucose, and it was technically back in range, and his A1C a week later. He said, that's how quick I reversed it. But you know what else he told me? And it was a fascinating thing. I'm into the calcium scan, as you well know. And I always tell people, you can get a guy with risk factors apparently and sky high cholesterol, like 400 milligrams LDL alone, 55 years old, with a 0 score. And you can get a guy with low cholesterol who looks great with a massive score, full of calcium, disaster. This guy was 50 something, but it speaks to genetic resistance to disease. He was grossly overweight, type 2 diabetic for 9 or 10 years. And he did his baseline calcium score only a few months before. He got a 0. So it just proves the point that you can have guys with dreadful bloods and diabetes, but actually, because of their genetics, whatever defense mechanisms they have, they actually don't develop as much disease as you think. And then you got the tophies who are not obese, and you can get guys who are quite fit, and they've got a huge score and they're heading straight for a heart attack. So the power of the calcium scan, it just goes past all the blood measures, walks past everything, looks into your heart and tells you, okay, you got a problem or you don't. Go do something, you know.
Can I tell you 1 minute story about that?
Yeah, you go.
To show you how entrenched the conventional doctors are in their paradigm. So I have a friend.
Excellent. And also you want to, if you have the book there, hold it up. We'll put the links in obviously after, but very good. And good. That's but the original book years back, 10 years ago, was
this is the new book. Yes, this is the new
same title.
Same title. It's completely revised and expanded with all the stuff and all the new data. And it's that. But here's the story. So I have a very close friend who is in the late 60s, as a woman, as fit as they come. She works out at Equinox every day. She's a joyous life. She's, so there's not a ton of stress. She has no risk factors for heart disease. She's fit and she has been running with about a 300 cholesterol for about a decade. And of course, it's measured the regular way. And she comes to me and I look at all the other stuff. Her triglycerides are like off the charts low. Her HDL triglyceride ratio is like, I die for that ratio. It's an inverse. It's under 1.0. She's got all great things, but she's got this 300 LDL. Not LDL, 300 total with like 150, 160 LDL. And her doctor has been literally, if you don't go on a statin, I'm firing you as a patient. And then she comes to me and I said, fire that doctor. But this has been going on for a decade. So the doctor finally says to her, okay, I'll tell you what, your crazy nutritionist keeps telling you it doesn't, we'll do a calcium scan. And that's going to determine it, right? Let's take a picture and see who's right. She gets a calcium scan. She's 68 years old. 0, Ivor. She goes back to the doctor. Do you know where this is going? She goes back to the doctor. He says, okay, but I want to put you on a statin anyway.
Yeah, that's bad. I've heard that, but in fairness, quite a bit of the time, the doctor will roll over then and say, okay, because he or she, the doctor, is kind of covered. So now they're kind of covered that, like, if she doesn't go on a statin, well, there is a 0 score, so they're covered. But some of them are so bad, you're right, they just want a statin or bust. It's shocking. But it's the new generation, I think, of doctors, younger, web savvy, they see a lot of the stuff we put out. I think the new generation has to come in. My own daughter is in second year med school in one of Ireland's top universities. And she just told me in first year, she showed me what they were teaching them. And it was just awful. There was no insulin focus. They were telling them the old cholesterol junk and low fat. And then I said, well, look, maybe in the next year or two, they'll have more and it'll be a little bit better because it doesn't look like they taught you anything. And she said, no, that's it. And I said, what do you mean that's it? Are you flunking college? No, she said, that's it. Next year, no, we're doing surgical. And that's it. We've done the metabolism. We've done the biochemistry stuff. It's done. I look. But I think on the internet, they're going to learn 10 times more than med school. And that's part of the hope for the
on
future.
YouTube now that are like medical lectures. I mean, David Simon does one of those. They're great. Yours are like amazing. And Robert Lustig has done lectures on YouTube that come right out of Stanford. Yeah, you can learn a lot of stuff if you're open to, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, this information is out there. And if you cannot attach so much to being right, as Dr. Franz said, you can see this stuff and you can make those changes. And I don't think you and I will be lucky enough to have changed the world in our lifetime, but we can change a few people. And that's worth something.
Absolutely, Johnny. Great job. And I'm going to put the links into the book there, the latest and greatest, full of juicy insulin stuff as well. And wish you the best with it. And
hope you see each other.
Get the message out.
If you come to the States, please stay in touch with email. I'd love to meet you in person again.
Absolutely. When this thing passes, all things pass. So when this viral thing passes, hopefully we'll get back to normal.
Yes.
And they won't keep travel limitations forever just to keep us all in little boxes. Hopefully we get back to the old normal when this passes.
Thank you. So great to meet you. Thank you for everything.
Great stuff, Johnny. Thank you. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Take care.
And just a reminder that I do need support to continue putting together all of this content. And at patreon.com/Ivor Cummins, or for PayPal, please see the description below this video or the pinned comment. And you can do a one-off or a monthly support. So I'd really appreciate that, guys, and keep me getting the science out there and countering perhaps the more biased corporate type science. Thank you.